My name is Olivia Carter. I'm 50 years old, and I sacrificed my entire youth caring for the Carter family, Texas oil barons who treated me like their surplus daughter for 3 decades. I thought Michael's memorial service would be a moment for family healing, but as rain still pattered against the coffin lid, my eldest brother Richard shattered the silence with the rustling of a file folder. A peace agreement, Olivia. Sign here, and everything will be simple. My trembling hands opened the envelope. Inside were forged mortgage contracts with blurred stamps and fake signatures, all designed to seize the 200-acre vineyard that Michael had secretly built for me during his final 3 years. The crowd held its breath. Even the birdsong seemed to die away. That's when I realized they had never seen me as family, only an obstacle to eliminate in order to claim a multi-million-dollar inheritance. That night, I locked Michael's office door and swore I wouldn't let them rewrite the story my husband had entrusted to me with love. But what I discovered in that secret basement, oil contracts, journals, and partner lists, would make the entire Carter dynasty pay the price. The morning after the memorial, I sat in Michael's leather chair, the same one where he'd spent countless evenings sketching plans for what I now knew was our vineyard. The oak desk still smelled faintly of his cologne, and scattered across its surface were the forged documents Richard had thrust into my hands like weapons. Each page bore my supposedly authentic signature, each date carefully backdated to before Michael's diagnosis. They had been planning this for months, perhaps years. I traced the watermark on one of the contracts with my fingertip, remembering how my father had taught me to spot forgeries back when I was 12, and he was still trying to include me in the family oil business. "The devil's in the details, Olivia," he'd said, pointing to the subtle differences in paper grain and ink density. Now, decades later, those lessons would serve me well. The signature loops were too perfect, the pressure too consistent. Whoever had forged these had never seen me actually sign my name under stress. They'd copied from formal documents, missing the slight tremor I'd developed after years of gripping paintbrushes. Growing up as the only daughter in a family of oil tycoons had been like living in a house where every room was designed for people taller than you. My 3 brothers, Richard, Paul, and Henry, had been groomed from childhood to take over different aspects of the Carter empire, while I was encouraged to pursue feminine interests like art and literature. When I'd shown aptitude for geology and business strategy, my suggestions were met with patronizing smiles and comments about how artistic types didn't understand the complexities of real business. The irony wasn't lost on me that my artistic eye for detail was now the very skill that would expose their criminal incompetence. Each forged document revealed itself under scrutiny, like a bad painting trying to pass for a masterpiece. The paper stock was wrong, the notary seals were suspicious, and most damning of all, they'd used a signature I'd only written 3 times in my life on my marriage certificate, Michael's insurance policy, and the deed to our first home. Someone had been planning this heist since the day I said I do. My phone buzzed against the mahogany surface. A text from Richard. "Hope you slept on it. The lawyers are expecting your signature by noon. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I set the phone aside without responding. Instead, I pulled open the bottom drawer of Michael's desk, the one that had always stuck slightly and required that particular upward lift he'd shown me years ago. Inside, beneath a stack of agricultural journals, I found what I was looking for: a small brass key attached to a leather cord. Michael had mentioned this key exactly once, during a fever dream in his final week. "The wine cellar," he'd whispered, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Behind the 87 Bordeaux. Everything you need is there." At the time, I'd assumed it was the morphine talking. Now I understood it was the most important thing he'd ever told me. But first, I needed to understand the full scope of what my brothers thought they were stealing. I spent the next hour going through Michael's financial records, each folder revealing another layer of the empire he'd built quietly while I'd been focused on my teaching career. The vineyard was just the visible peak of an iceberg that included mineral rights, water rights, and strategic land holdings across 3 states. Michael hadn't just been my husband. He'd been a strategic genius who'd spent 20 years positioning himself to protect me from the family that had never valued me. The drive to the Oregon vineyard took 3 hours through winding mountain roads that Michael and I had traveled together so many times. Each curve revealed memories. The roadside stand where we'd bought our first bottle of local wine. The overlook where he'd proposed for the second time on our 10th anniversary. The small bridge where we'd scattered rose petals just because it was Tuesday and we were happy. Now the landscape felt different, weighted with secrets and purpose. As I drove, I remembered the last real conversation I'd had with my father before his stroke. I was 28, had just married Michael, and was pregnant with Anna. "You know, Olivia," he'd said, watching me paint in the garden studio he'd built for my 16th birthday. "I always thought you got the best parts of the Carter brain. Your brothers, they think with their fists and their bank accounts. But you see patterns they miss, connections they can't make. Don't let them convince you that soft is the same as weak." He died 6 months later, and at the reading of his will, I discovered he'd left me a trust fund that would mature when I turned 50. Richard had been furious, claiming that daughters shouldn't inherit business assets they couldn't manage. What he hadn't known was that the trust wasn't just money. It was shares in every major energy company in Texas, carefully accumulated over decades, and now worth more than the rest of the Carter estate combined. The vineyard stretched across rolling hills like something from a European postcard, neat rows of dormant vines creating geometric patterns across the winter landscape. Michael had spent 3 years transforming what was once scrubland into this masterpiece, hiring the best viticulturists from Napa Valley and installing state-of-the-art irrigation systems. The main house was a restored 1920s farmhouse, painted sage green with white trim and wraparound porches that caught both sunrise and sunset. Behind it stood the wine cellar, a stone building that looked like it had been transplanted from a French chateau. I'd been here exactly twice before, once when Michael first bought the land, when it was nothing but weeds and broken fence posts, and once 6 months ago when he'd insisted on showing me the completed tasting room. Both times, he'd kept me away from the cellar, claiming it wasn't ready for visitors. Now I understood why. The cellar's heavy wooden door opened with a groan that echoed through the underground space. Rows of wine racks stretched into darkness, filled with bottles that gleamed like jewels in the dim light filtering through high windows. I found the 1987 Bordeaux section easily. Michael had always been meticulous about organization. Behind the third rack, exactly where he'd said, was a narrow gap in the stone wall that I'd never noticed before. The brass key fit perfectly into a nearly invisible lock hidden behind a loose stone. When I turned it, a section of the wall swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a small room that took my breath away. This wasn't just storage, it was a shrine to our life together, a museum of the woman Michael had seen me as, even when I couldn't see it myself. Every painting I'd ever created hung on the walls, including pieces I'd thought were lost forever. My college portfolio, the watercolor series I'd painted during our honeymoon in Tuscany, even the angry abstract I'd created after our miscarriage and thought I'd destroyed. In the center of the room stood an easel with a fresh canvas and a palette of colors arranged exactly the way I preferred them. Beside it was a note in Michael's careful handwriting. "For the masterpiece you haven't painted yet." But it was the filing cabinet in the corner that made my heart race. Inside were documents that told a story I'd never known. Land surveys, geological reports, oil rights transfers, and correspondence with energy companies dating back 40 years. Michael hadn't just bought us a vineyard. He'd acquired land that sat atop one of the largest untapped oil reserves in Oregon. The vineyard was beautiful, but what lay beneath it was worth hundreds of millions. More shocking still were the financial records showing systematic embezzlement from Carter Oil over the past 2 decades. Richard, Paul, and Henry had been siphoning money through shell companies and fake consulting contracts, using their positions to enrich themselves while running the family business into the ground. They needed my inheritance not just for greed, but for survival. They were months away from bankruptcy and potential prison time. The paper trail was meticulous and damning. Fake invoices from non-existent construction companies, environmental reports that had been altered to hide contamination, bribes to state officials disguised as consulting fees. My brothers hadn't just been stealing from the family business. They'd been looting it like pirates, assuming they'd never be caught because who would suspect the founding family of criminal behavior? As I photographed each document with my phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Michael's diagnosis: hope mixed with fury. They thought I was just the soft-spoken art teacher who'd never fought back before. They had no idea that growing up as the only girl in a family of ruthless oilmen had taught me to recognize opportunity when it presented itself, to catalog every slight and weakness for future use. The last folder contained something that made my hands shake: adoption papers. Michael Carter wasn't my husband's birth name. He'd been born Michael Castellano, the illegitimate son of my father's business partner, given up for adoption when his mother was barely 16. He'd spent his entire adult life building a fortune not to give his brothers what they thought they deserved, but to protect me from them. Everything he'd done, the vineyard, the oil rights, even marrying into the Carter family, had been part of a decades-long plan to ensure I'd never be vulnerable to their cruelty. In that moment, standing in the hidden room surrounded by the evidence of my husband's love and my brother's betrayal, I felt my grief transform into something harder and more focused. They wanted to erase me from the story? Let them try. But first, they'd have to survive what was coming. I returned to Seattle that evening with a plan crystallizing in my mind like ice forming on a winter pond. Slowly at first, then with gathering inevitability. The Carter brothers expected me to crumble under pressure, to sign their fraudulent documents and fade quietly into the background of their financial schemes. Instead, I was going to give them exactly what they deserved: the truth, delivered with surgical precision. My first call was to Anna, my 23-year-old daughter who was finishing her pre-med studies at Portland State. Anna had inherited Michael's strategic mind and my artistic eye for detail, a combination that made her both compassionate and formidable. When I explained what her uncles had attempted, her voice went dangerously quiet. "Mom, I need you to know something," she said after a long pause. "Uncle Paul approached me last week. He offered to pay off my student loans and fund medical school if I convinced you to sign the papers. He said it would be better for everyone if you just accepted that Dad's death meant things had to change." My grip tightened on the phone. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it." Then I recorded the entire conversation on my phone. Anna's laugh held no warmth. "I've been waiting for you to realize what kind of people they really are. Dad always said you were stronger than you knew. I think it's time to prove him right." Within an hour, Anna had forwarded me the audio file, along with screenshots of text messages from Paul detailing his generous offer. The messages laid out their entire strategy: isolate me from family support, make me financially dependent on their goodwill, then gradually take control of all Michael's assets. What they hadn't counted on was raising a daughter who understood that loyalty had to be earned, not assumed. The recording was even more damning than I'd expected. Paul's voice was clear and confident as he explained to Anna how her mother had always been a bit unstable, especially since your father got sick. She needs someone to make decisions for her, and frankly, we're better equipped to handle this kind of responsibility. The vineyard is a money pit. She'll lose everything if we don't step in. But it was Anna's responses that made me proud beyond measure. Where I would have stammered and tried to find middle ground, my daughter had been coolly professional, asking probing questions that got Paul to reveal more than he'd intended. "What happens if she refuses to sign?" Anna had asked. "Then she'll find out what happens to people who don't understand family loyalty," Paul had replied, his tone shifting from patronizing to threatening. My second ally emerged from an unexpected source. Sarah Chen, an investigative reporter for the Oregonian, had been following a story about illegal oil drilling on protected land when she'd noticed the Carter name appearing in multiple suspicious transactions. She'd reached out to me hoping for background information, but when I shared what I'd discovered in Michael's hidden room, she realized she'd stumbled onto something much larger. "Mrs. Carter," she said during our first meeting at a small cafe in downtown Portland, "what you've uncovered isn't just family drama. This is environmental fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy spanning multiple states. If we can prove what I think we can prove, your brothers won't just lose their lawsuit, they'll lose their freedom." Sarah's investigation had revealed that Carter Oil had been illegally extracting resources from federal land for years, using forged environmental impact reports and bribing local officials to look the other way. The company that Richard, Paul, and Henry had been so desperate to inherit was actually a criminal enterprise on the verge of federal prosecution. My inheritance wasn't just valuable, it was their only escape route from a scandal that could destroy them completely. Over coffee that lasted 3 hours, Sarah walked me through the evidence she'd been collecting independently. Satellite photos showing unauthorized drilling operations, water samples revealing contamination levels that exceeded federal limits by thousands of %, financial records indicating systematic bribery of EPA officials. She'd been building a case for months, but what I'd brought her was the missing piece, proof that the fraud went to the very top of the Carter family hierarchy. "The beautiful thing about white-collar crime," Sarah explained with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found her calling, "is that criminals always keep records. They can't help themselves. Every bribe, every forged document, every illegal transaction, it's all documented somewhere because these people genuinely believe they're too powerful to ever be held accountable." But understanding their desperation only made them more dangerous. 3 days after my meeting with Sarah, I arrived at the vineyard to find the irrigation system destroyed. Someone had cut through the main water lines during the night, and hundreds of gallons had flooded the basement of the main house, destroying boxes of Michael's personal belongings that I hadn't yet moved to safety. Worse, they'd broken into my hidden room and attempted to steal the filing cabinet, though the lock had held long enough for the security system Michael had secretly installed to capture everything on camera. The footage showed Henry's face clearly as he crowbarred at the cabinet, swearing with increasing frustration as the reinforced steel refused to yield. But it was what he did next that revealed the true depth of their malice. Before leaving, he'd taken a can of spray paint and written "whore" across my paintings, the word dripping down the canvases like blood. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he'd urinated on the easel Michael had set up for me, defiling the space where my husband had hoped I'd find healing through art. I stood in that violated space, surrounded by ruined artwork and the stench of spilled paint, and worse, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. They hadn't just attacked my property, they'd attacked my identity, my creativity, everything Michael had carefully preserved as a testament to who I was beyond their narrow definition of worthless woman. That's when I stopped thinking like a grieving widow and started thinking like a Carter, calculating, ruthless, and absolutely committed to total victory. The destruction hadn't been random vandalism. It had been psychological warfare, designed to break my spirit and make me too ashamed to continue fighting. They wanted me to feel violated, diminished, unworthy of the legacy Michael had left me. Instead, Their cruelty had clarified something I'd been struggling with since his death. I didn't owe them forgiveness, understanding, or even basic civility. They were enemies now, and enemies deserved to be defeated completely. I spent the next week transforming that violation into fuel for my counterattack. First, I hired a private security company to monitor the vineyard around the clock, not just to prevent future break-ins, but to document any attempts at intimidation or sabotage. Then I contacted a restoration specialist who photographed the damaged paintings in excruciating detail, creating documentation that would support both insurance claims and criminal charges. But most importantly, I started painting again for the first time in years. In the violated room where Henry had tried to destroy my artistic voice, I set up a new easel and began creating the most powerful work of my career. The destroyed canvases became part of new compositions, collages that incorporated the spray paint and damage into broader statements about resilience, transformation, and the beauty that could emerge from attempted destruction. The first painting I completed was called Baptism by Hatred, and it featured fragments of my ruined work arranged around a central figure of a woman rising from water that might have been tears or might have been flood damage. The spray-painted word whore became part of a larger text that read, "Whore, wife, warrior, winner," reclaiming the slur and transforming it into a declaration of strength. Meanwhile, Sarah's investigation was bearing fruit in ways that exceeded my most optimistic expectations. Her connections in the environmental movement had led to federal agencies taking notice of Carter Oil's violations. The EPA was quietly building a case that would result in criminal charges, while the IRS was examining decades of suspicious tax filings. Most dangerous of all for my brothers, the FBI's Organized Crime Division had begun investigating the web of shell companies and offshore accounts that had been used to launder stolen money. The noose was tightening, but Richard, Paul, and Henry were too arrogant to see it. They continued to believe that their traditional advantages, money, connections, and social position, would protect them from consequences. They'd grown up in a world where Carter men didn't face real accountability, where wealth and influence could solve any problem and silence any accuser. They had no idea they were dealing with a different kind of Carter woman than any they'd encountered before. The next escalation came exactly 1 week after the break-in. I was teaching my advanced painting class at Seattle Community College when my phone rang with a call from the Vineyard Security Company. "Mrs. Carter, we have a situation. 3 men claiming to be family members are attempting to enter the property with a court order." I excused myself from class and called the security company back while driving toward Oregon at speeds that would have terrified Michael. The court order was another forgery, this one claiming that I'd been declared mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs, and that my brothers had been appointed as guardians of my estate. The security guards, thankfully, were professional enough to recognize that a legitimate court order wouldn't be handwritten on copy paper and wouldn't misspell incompetent. By the time I arrived at the vineyard, Richard, Paul, and Henry were standing outside the gate in heated conversation with the head of security. They looked like what they were, desperate men who'd run out of legal options and were now reduced to increasingly sloppy attempts at fraud. When they saw my car pulling up the drive, their expressions shifted from frustrated anger to something approaching panic. "Olivia!" Richard called out, plastering on his most patronizing smile. "Thank God you're here." "There's been some kind of misunderstanding with your security people. We just came to check on the property, make sure everything's being maintained properly." I got out of my car slowly, letting them see that I wasn't the same broken widow they'd confronted at Michael's memorial. I was wearing the emerald silk dress Michael had bought me for our anniversary, along with jewelry that had belonged to his grandmother, every piece chosen to remind them that I belonged here in ways they never would. "The only misunderstanding," I said calmly, "is your belief that you have any right to be on my property. This is private land. You're trespassing, And that document you tried to use is such an obvious forgery that I'm surprised you had the audacity to present it with a straight face. Paul stepped forward aggressively. Now listen here, Olivia. No, I interrupted, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned from 30 years of managing classrooms full of teenagers. You listen. I know about the embezzlement. I know about the shell companies. I know about the bribes, the forged environmental reports, and the systematic looting of Carter Oil. I know about the federal investigation that's going to destroy what's left of your lives. And I know that you're so desperate to get your hands on this property because you think it's your only chance to pay off the debts you've accumulated through your own criminal stupidity. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the wind moving through the grapevines. Henry's face had gone ash gray, while Paul looked like he might vomit. Only Richard maintained any composure, but I could see the calculation in his eyes as he tried to figure out how much I knew and how much was bluff. You're making very serious accusations, he said finally. I hope you can back them up. I smiled, and for the first time in my life, I saw one of my brothers actually flinch at my expression. Oh, Richard, you have no idea what I can back up, but you're going to find out very soon. The next morning, I called Richard from my hotel room in Portland, keeping my voice steady and resigned. You win, I said. I'll sign the papers. But I want a family meeting first, all three of you, with your wives. If I'm giving up everything Michael worked for, I want to understand why you think you deserve it more than I do. Richard's relief was palpable through the phone. Of course, Olivia. We never wanted this to be adversarial. We're family. The word tasted like poison in his mouth, but I swallowed my revulsion and played my part perfectly. We arranged to meet at Le Pigeon, Portland's most exclusive restaurant, the following Saturday at 8 p.m. I insisted on treating, claiming it was my way of making peace with the situation. What they didn't know was that I'd spent the week since Henry's break-in preparing the most elaborate trap of my life. With Sarah's help, I'd contacted the FBI's white-collar crime division, providing them with copies of every document from Michael's hidden room. Agent Martinez had been particularly interested in the Shell Company records and had agreed to coordinate with the Oregon State Police for what she called a controlled interaction. Meanwhile, Anna had been busy on the technological front, using skills she'd learned from her computer science boyfriend to trace the IP addresses of several anonymous emails I'd received since the memorial. The messages had been crude attempts at intimidation, photos of car accidents with captions like "dangerous roads in Oregon," and newspaper clippings about women who died in home invasion robberies. What my brothers hadn't realized was that their scare tactics were actually gift-wrapped evidence of criminal conspiracy. The emails had been sent from computers at Carter Oil headquarters during business hours, using the company's IP address. Anna had also discovered that the same computers had been used to create the forged documents, access my personal banking information illegally, and coordinate with the shell companies used for money laundering. Every digital breadcrumb led back to my brothers, creating an electronic paper trail that would be impossible to deny in court. But perhaps most importantly, I'd spent every morning that week in the vineyard's temporary studio, painting with a fury and clarity I hadn't felt in years. The destroyed canvases in the hidden room had been painful to lose, but they'd also been relics of who I used to be. Careful, accommodating, afraid to take up space. The new paintings emerging on my easel were different, bold, angry, unapologetic. They told the story of a woman who'd finally stopped asking permission to exist. The centerpiece of my new collection was a massive canvas I'd titled "The Last Supper of the Carter Dynasty." It depicted my three brothers seated at a banquet table laden with oil barrels instead of food, their faces twisted with greed as they reached for golden coins that dissolved into ash at their touch. Behind them loomed the ghostly figure of our father, his expression one of profound disappointment. It was the kind of painting that would be discussed in art history classes decades from now, assuming any of us lived to see decades from now. The day before our restaurant meeting, I made one final preparation. I drove to the cemetery where Michael was buried and stood beside his grave for the first time since the funeral. The headstone was simple black granite engraved with his name, dates, and a line from a poem he'd loved. Love is not consolation. It is light. I'm about to do something that might shock you, I said to the stone, feeling foolish but needing to say the words aloud. I'm going to fight back the way you would have. I'm going to use everything you taught me about business and strategy and never backing down from bullies. And I'm going to win. The wind picked up as I spoke, rustling through the oak trees and carrying the scent of rain. For just a moment, I could have sworn I felt Michael's hand on my shoulder, the same gentle pressure he'd used to give me courage before every art gallery opening, every difficult conversation, every leap of faith we'd taken together. When I left the cemetery that afternoon, I was no longer just Olivia Carter, the overlooked daughter and grieving widow. I was the woman Michael had seen all along, someone with the strength to rewrite her own story, no matter who tried to stop her. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes everything seem sharper, more consequential. I spent an hour choosing my outfit, not the black morning dress my brothers expected, but a deep emerald silk blouse Michael had bought me in Italy, paired with the pearl earrings that had belonged to his grandmother. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a woman who belonged at the head of the Carter family table. Le Pigeon buzzed with the quiet energy of Portland's elite dining scene, all understated elegance and carefully curated atmosphere. The maitre d' led me to our reserved private dining room, where Richard, Paul, and Henry waited with their wives, champagne already flowing as if they were celebrating a victory they hadn't yet achieved. They rose when I entered, their faces wearing matching expressions of condescending sympathy. "Olivia, darling," Richard's wife Patricia cooed, air kissing my cheeks with the practiced insincerity of someone who'd never liked me but had been taught to pretend otherwise. "We're so proud of you for being reasonable about this. Michael would have wanted what's best for the whole family." I smiled and took my seat at the head of the table, the position traditionally reserved for the family patriarch, or in this case, the person paying for dinner. "Thank you all for coming. Before we discuss the documents, I thought we should talk about family history. After all, if I'm signing away my inheritance, I should understand what I'm signing it over to." The first course arrived, delicate amuse-bouche that none of us touched as the conversation began in earnest. Richard cleared his throat and launched into a rehearsed speech about family legacy, responsibility, and the burden of managing significant wealth. "The vineyard is beautiful, Olivia, but it's not practical. We have connections in Napa Valley who could develop the land properly, maybe turn it into a resort. You'd receive a generous settlement, of course, enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life." "How generous?" I asked, cutting through his flowery language. Paul leaned forward eagerly. $2 million cash. That's more than most people see in a lifetime." I nodded thoughtfully while calculating that $2 million was roughly 1% of the property's actual value, including oil rights. That does sound generous. But I'm curious about something. The geological surveys in Michael's files suggest there might be mineral rights involved. Shouldn't that affect the valuation? The brothers exchanged glances so quickly most people would have missed it, but I'd been watching for exactly that tell. Henry spoke up first, his voice carrying just a hint of condescension. "Oh, Olivia, those old surveys are worthless. The land's been tested extensively. There's nothing down there but dirt and rocks." "That's strange," I mused, taking a sip of wine, "because I have more recent geological reports that tell a very different story. In fact, I have quite a lot of documentation that seems to contradict what you're telling me. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Patricia's laugh sounded forced. Documentation can be confusing for people who aren't familiar with technical language. That's why it's better to let the experts handle these things. You mean experts like the ones who've been filing false environmental impact reports for Carter Oil? Or experts like the consulting companies that exist only on paper, but somehow bill hundreds of thousands of dollars annually? I kept my voice conversational, almost friendly, as I watched the color drain from Richard's face. Paul's fork clattered against his plate. I don't know what kind of lies someone's been filling your head with, but no lies, I interrupted gently. Just facts. For instance, did you know that Michael wasn't actually a Carter by birth? He was adopted, which means he wasn't legally entitled to inherit from our father. Everything he built himself. Everything he left me, he earned himself, which makes your forged documents not just fraudulent, but completely pointless. Henry slammed his hand on the table hard enough to make the glassware ring. That's impossible. We've seen his birth certificate. You've seen a birth certificate, I corrected. But birth certificates can be amended after adoption. The original documents tell a different story. One about a pregnant 16-year-old girl named Maria Castellano and her son Michael, who was placed for adoption through Catholic Charities in 1952. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the soft jazz playing in the main dining room. Richard's face had gone from pale to gray, and his hands were visibly shaking as he reached for his wine glass. Even if that were true, he said finally, it doesn't change anything. You're still our sister. We're still family. Are we? I asked, pulling out my phone and setting it on the table, because family members don't usually do this to each other. I pressed play on Anna's recording. Paul's voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakable. Look, your mother's always been a bit unstable, especially since your father got sick. She needs someone to make decisions for her, and frankly, we're better equipped to handle this kind of responsibility. If you help us convince her to be reasonable, I'll make sure you never have to worry about money again. Anna's response was ice cold. And if I don't help you steal my mother's inheritance, then you'll find out what happens to people who don't understand family loyalty. I stopped the recording and looked around the table. That sounds like a threat to me. What do you think, Agent Martinez? The private dining room door opened, and FBI Agent Martinez entered with 2 Oregon State Police officers. The brothers' wives gasped in unison, Patricia's champagne glass shattering against the floor as her hands flew to her throat. "Good evening, gentlemen," Agent Martinez said pleasantly. "I'm Agent Martinez with the FBI's White Collar Crime Division. We'd like to have a word with you about some irregularities in Carter Oil's financial records." What followed was perhaps the most satisfying 20 minutes of my life. As Agent Martinez read them their rights, I continued eating my perfectly prepared salmon while watching 3 decades of condescension and cruelty crumble into desperate pleading. Richard begged me to remember our childhood together, conveniently forgetting how he'd locked me in the basement storage room whenever I'd tried to join his games. Paul reminded me of the time he'd paid for my art supplies in high school, neglecting to mention that he'd stolen the money from our mother's purse. Henry actually had the audacity to claim they'd been protecting me from the burden of wealth, as if I were too fragile to handle my own affairs. But the most pathetic moment came when Richard's wife, Patricia, turned to me with tears streaming down her face. "How could you do this to family?" she sobbed. "What will happen to the children?" "What will happen to us?" I set down my fork and looked at her with all the compassion I might have shown a stranger on the street, which I realized was exactly what she was to me now. "Patricia," I said gently, "you should have thought about the children before you helped your husband commit federal crimes. And as for what will happen to you, well, I suppose you'll find out what it's like to live without the protection of Carter money. Millions of women manage it every day." "The really fascinating part," Agent Martinez explained as she secured the documents I'd brought in evidence bags, "is that this conspiracy goes back years. We've been investigating Carter Oil for environmental violations, but Mrs. Carter's evidence shows systematic fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. We're looking at federal charges that could result in decades of prison time." As they led my brothers away in handcuffs, Richard turned back to me one last time. "You don't understand what you've done," he hissed. "Without us, you're nothing. You're just a failed artist who married into money you didn't earn." I stood up slowly, every inch the matriarch I'd been born to be. "You're right about one thing, Richard. I am an artist, and after tonight, I finally have the inspiration for my masterpiece." The restaurant had gone completely silent, staff and other diners watching in fascination as Portland's most dramatic dinner party reached its conclusion. I paid the check with Michael's credit card, my credit card now, and left a generous tip for the servers who'd witnessed the Carter dynasty's final act. Outside, Anna waited by my car with Sarah Chen, who'd been documenting everything for her story. "How do you feel, Mom?" Anna asked, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like victory and new beginnings. I looked back at the restaurant where my brothers were being processed for arrest, then up at the Portland skyline glittering against the night sky. "I feel like myself, for the first time in years." But the story wasn't over yet. The next 6 months brought a cascade of revelations that made the evening at Le Pigeon look like a gentle prelude to a symphony of destruction. Sarah's investigative series, titled The Carter Papers, ran for 3 weeks in the Oregonian and was picked up by national news outlets. Each installment revealed new depths of corruption, bribes to EPA officials, illegal dumping that had contaminated entire watersheds, systematic fraud that stretched back to our father's generation. The environmental damage alone was staggering. Federal investigators discovered that Carter Oil had been using injection wells to dispose of toxic waste in violation of every safety protocol, creating underground plumes of contamination that threatened the drinking water of 3 counties. The cleanup costs were estimated at over $2 billion, money that would have to come from the Carter family's personal assets once their corporate protections were stripped away. More satisfying to me personally was the discovery of what my brothers had done with the money they'd stolen. Rather than investing it wisely, they'd burned through millions on lifestyle inflation, second homes in Aspen, yacht clubs in Martha's Vineyard, private school tuition for children who'd never been taught the value of money. Paul alone had spent $300,000 on a wine collection, most of which turned out to be clever forgeries sold by a dealer who'd been scamming rich clients for years. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my brothers had been buying fake wines with stolen money, I was sitting on a genuine vineyard that would produce bottles worth more per case than Paul had paid for his entire collection. Life has a way of revealing poetry in the most unexpected places. The legal proceedings moved with surprising speed once federal agencies became involved. Richard, as the architect of most of the financial fraud, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Paul received 12 years after agreeing to cooperate with investigators, though his cooperation mostly consisted of trying to blame everything on Richard and Henry. Henry, whose violent tendencies had always made him the least intelligent of the 3, was sentenced to 10 years plus 5 years of supervised probation. But prison time was only part of their punishment. The civil asset forfeiture proceedings stripped them of everything: houses, cars, boats, art collections, even Patricia's jewelry collection that she'd claimed was separate property. The federal government was ruthless in pursuing every dollar that could be connected to criminal activity, and after decades of careless money laundering, almost everything the Carter brothers owned fell into that category. Their wives filed for divorce within weeks of the sentencing, each claiming they'd had no knowledge of their husband's criminal activities. The courts were skeptical, given the lavish lifestyles they'd enjoyed, but ultimately allowed them to keep minimal assets in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations. Watching Patricia reduced to living in a studio apartment and working as a retail clerk was almost as satisfying as seeing Richard in an orange jumpsuit. The vindication was complete, but it was also hollow in ways I hadn't expected. I'd spent 30 years being angry at my brothers for treating me as less than equal, and now that they were completely destroyed, I found that the anger had been replaced by something more like pity. They'd had every advantage in life: wealth, education, social position, gender privilege, and they'd thrown it all away because they couldn't accept that their sister might deserve respect. The morning after their sentencing, I stood in the vineyard surrounded by my new paintings, not the careful, apologetic work of my youth, but bold declarations of a woman who'd finally learned to take up space. Anna had graduated summa cum laude and been accepted to medical school with a full scholarship funded by the Carter Foundation, which I'd established to support young women pursuing careers in male-dominated fields. Sarah Chen's investigative series had won a Pulitzer Prize and led to congressional hearings on corporate environmental fraud. But the most meaningful change was internal. For the first time in my life, I woke up each morning without the weight of other people's expectations pressing down on my chest. I painted what I wanted to paint, said what I wanted to say, lived in the space I'd earned, rather than the corners I'd been assigned. The vineyard had become more than just a business. It was a symbol of what was possible when women stopped asking for permission and started taking what was rightfully theirs. 6 months after the sentencing, I received a letter from Richard in prison. It was 3 pages of self-pity and attempts at manipulation, full of references to our childhood together and pleas for me to remember the good times we'd shared. He claimed he'd been led astray by bad influences, that he'd never meant to hurt me, that he'd always loved me as a sister. I read the letter once, then fed it into the fireplace in Michael's study. Some relationships can't be repaired because they were never authentic to begin with. My brothers had never loved me. They'd loved the idea of having a sister who would admire them unconditionally while asking for nothing in return. When I'd finally demanded equality, they'd revealed their true nature. But their destruction had created space for real relationships to flourish. Anna and I grew closer as we worked together on the foundation, creating programs that would prevent other women from experiencing the isolation and financial vulnerability I'd endured. Sarah became a trusted friend whose journalistic instincts complemented my artistic vision. Even the vineyard workers, who'd initially been suspicious of the city woman who'd inherited their workplace, came to respect my commitment to both excellence and fairness. The vineyard itself had become a pilgrimage site of sorts for women who'd heard my story and wanted to see the place where the Carter dynasty had fallen. I started offering tours that combined wine tasting with discussions about women's financial empowerment, turning tragedy into education. The irony that my brother's greed had accidentally created a feminist teaching tool wasn't lost on anyone who knew the full story. As autumn arrived and our second harvest began, I discovered that Michael had planned even this detail perfectly. The grapes he'd chosen produced wines that improved with age, developing complexity and depth that reflected the soil's unique mineral content. The 2019 vintage, made from grapes that had been growing during the worst of my legal battles, was particularly remarkable. Robust enough to cellar for decades, with notes of dark fruit and earth that somehow captured both struggle and triumph. I decided to call it Vindication, with labels featuring reproductions of my paintings from the hidden room. The wine sold out within hours of release, with buyers from around the world eager to taste the vintage born from one of Oregon's most spectacular legal battles. Wine Spectator gave it a 95-point rating and described it as a profound expression of terroir and human resilience. Standing in my vineyard at sunset, watching the light paint the hills in shades of gold and crimson, I often think about the woman I was before Michael's death, accommodating, invisible, apologetic for taking up space in my own life. That woman would have signed the papers, accepted the crumbs, and spent the rest of her days wondering what might have been different if she'd just found the courage to fight back. But that woman is gone, replaced by someone who understands that grief can be transformed into strength, that love can be more powerful than greed, and that sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to disappear when others demand it. The hidden room beneath the vineyard had contained more than documents and paintings. It had held the key to understanding that I'd always been stronger than I knew. I learned something profound in those months of legal warfare. Real love doesn't ask you to make yourself smaller so others can feel larger. It gives you the tools and the courage to claim the space you've always deserved, even when the people who should support you choose to tear you down instead. Michael's greatest gift wasn't the vineyard or the financial security. It was the reminder that I had always been worthy of respect, protection, and unconditional love. For 30 years, I believed that keeping peace meant accepting less than I deserved. I thought that being the good sister meant never challenging my brother's assumption that their voices mattered more than mine. Their dreams were more important than my reality. Their comfort was worth more than my dignity. I was wrong about all of it. The truth is that some people will only respect you when you stop asking for their respect and start demanding it. Some relationships can only be saved by ending them. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop accepting crumbs from people who should be offering you the whole cake. The Carter Foundation now supports hundreds of women annually. Women who've been financially abused by family members, women who've been excluded from family businesses, women who've been told they're too emotional for wanting basic fairness. Each scholarship, each legal aid grant, each small business loan is a small act of revenge against a system that tells women to be grateful for whatever scraps they're given. But perhaps the most important lesson I learned is that justice delayed is not justice denied. It's justice fermented, aged to perfection, and served at exactly the right temperature. My brothers thought they could erase me from the family story, but instead they became footnotes in mine. If you're listening to this story and recognizing echoes of your own life, if you've ever been told you're too emotional for wanting basic fairness, too sensitive for objecting to disrespect, or too demanding for expecting equality in your own family, I want you to know that your instincts are correct. You are not asking for too much. You are not imagining the slights, the dismissals, the casual cruelty disguised as concern for your well-being. The people who benefit from your silence will always have reasons why now isn't the right time to speak up, why your approach isn't quite right, why your pain isn't as important as their comfort. They'll tell you that fighting back makes you just as bad as they are, that family should forgive anything, that letting go means accepting injustice with a smile. But here's what I wish someone had told me decades ago. Forgiveness without accountability isn't healing, it's enabling. Peace without justice isn't harmony, it's surrender. And love that requires you to disappear isn't love at all, it's possession. You don't owe anyone your silence. You don't owe anyone your suffering. And you certainly don't owe anyone the right to rewrite your story in ways that erase your worth, your contributions, or your right to exist fully in your own life. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been silenced by family members who mistake your kindness for weakness, or if you're ready to stop apologizing for taking up space in your own life, then you're part of a community that's bigger than you might imagine. Share this story with other women who need to hear that their voices matter, that their stories deserve to be told, and that it's never too late to rewrite the ending. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of women who refuse to disappear, who transformed their pain into power, and who discovered that the most radical act of love is sometimes learning to love yourself enough to fight back. Because when women stop asking for permission and start taking what's rightfully theirs, the whole world becomes a different place. One conversation, one confrontation, one vineyard at a time. The Carter dynasty is over, but my story is just beginning. And the best part is, I'm the one holding the pen.